the question about gender neutrality. And then someone had said, okay, I see we've got a few more questions over here. And let me just go through this. Please, colleagues, if you do have questions, you're free to raise your hand and we'll take your questions. But let's see what has been put in the chat. So, were people able to see the pronoun part of the presentation? Julian, can I just check with you that I'm audible still?
Yes, you are. You're still audible.
Okay, were you able to see the pronoun part?
I think on my side I could, but I'm not too
Okay,
sure
some
about
people
other
are saying
colleagues.
they would. Maybe it just showed up a bit later.
It's
And then, okay, and then I see people, here's another comment. Let me see if there's a comment and a question. People who identify themselves as intersex, what category are they identifying themselves in when completing formal documents like employment forms, academic forms, or falling under other? So this is, thank you so much for raising this. So this is exactly the problem we have, particularly with intersex persons, because there is no space for them as yet, right? There's no space to include that variation. So we need to then administratively ensure that there is a measure of inclusion for intersex persons on forms, and sometimes others not a other also feels very difficult in the South African context because we know there's so much political history even behind racial relations. So sometimes when you wanna, tick in those boxes that have been created as prescriptions for like racial identity, like white, black, colored, Indian, etc. And then you get other. It's also very finicky when it comes to that. And so in terms of for LGBTI people, other also feels like they're being more othered. I would suggest, particularly if we're going to look at administrative reform, we look at what the potential of the forms could look like. So if you're going to say other, at least you can create a measure where someone can fill in what the other specifically means and not just leave it at other. So then they could say other and then physically fill in intersex, physically fill in non-binary, physically fill in gender non-conforming. I hope that helps. I see there is, okay, Siyabona said, okay, Clifford said that they also could see now. Okay, sure. So everybody, I don't know if there are any other questions before we move on, because now I want to move into the nitty-gritty of workplaces itself, the workplace and what we can do to create safer environments. So here we have another comment. This is from Tabile. And Tabile says in the workplace, where do we start with getting ready to appoint, retain, and accommodate the LGBTI community? I think we can all look at this collectively because we can park it other just before I park on the next part of the presentation which deals specifically the workplace consent framing. So, do we first encourage the current employees to disclose their orientation, and how do we do that? That's a very good question. Do we change our attendance registers to not only have male and female only? Good question. Wait for government home affairs to effect changes on IDs, or do we wait for government to develop policies on the subject matter? So I think this is a very beautiful framing of how we can approach the next section, and where do we really start to ensure inclusion or measures are in place. Right from the start, I'm going to say to you, Sabile, that it's a multi-pronged approach. All of these things can happen simultaneously. And that's actually the beauty of government. while one process is going on, another process can also go on. But let's revisit your questions, particularly in reference to the next part of the training. So I'm going to be focusing now specifically on the workplace itself. This this section is going to deal with the workplace and challenges in the workplace, and then also legislative reform and legislative policies that are protections in the workplace, and what can be done then to also combat discrimination in the workplace. So let me just share my screen again. Um, okay. Just to check in with you, Julian, am I visible over here with the screen?
Yes, you are. Roche, can you please put it onto slideshow because right now it looks like you have scrolled to the bottom and some words are being cut off.
Okay. Let me just check. Is that better now?
It's just no, it's same on my side for now. It hasn't changed.
Is it? Okay, let me just see if I can. Um, is it still being cut off?
Yes, it's like you've scrolled right to the top on my side. I'm not sure about other colleagues, but it's like seems like you've scrolled right to the top where part of your presentation slide is cut off.
Okay, I'm not sure how to remedy this.
Okay,
Um,
let's go back to slideshow on the top. If we can just direct from the first slide.
there we go. Is it full screen?
Okay, still on my side. I think you need to unshare. So sorry, unshare and share again.
Okay, let me try again. Okay, let's just go here. Okay, slideshow from first slide. Are we winning?
No, I'm not too sure what is going on, but on our side, I see it's still the same. I'm not too sure if it's just me or do other colleagues have the same view? Yes, yes. Now that's much better, Roche.
Okay, now let me do this. Um, winning?
It's fine. It's still on your slide, but I think it's much better now.
Okay, apologies for that, colleagues. I'm not sure what it looks like from your side. I can only see it here. So, let's go through this quickly, right? In the workplace, we have various forms of discrimination. And I mean, particularly in the South African context, we know that discriminatory practices are taken very seriously in terms of racial discrimination, right? We have very steadfast disciplinary actions. We have different mechanisms in place to ensure that there are no measures of discrimination. But now, when it comes to discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, um, and sex characteristics, we can see that it takes its forms in various ways. It can be structural, administrative, or interpersonal discrimination. So, for instance, with structural discrimination, things that are subtle would be, for instance, non-inclusive forms. And here's where I want to touch on that point with Tabili about non-inclusive forms, right? So this would will then show that there's no space for non-binary people. There's no allowance for trans persons to then apply for jobs because sometimes the documents don't match the application. There's also intersex people that experience this. So that's one of the structural violences of means of discrimination. Then bathrooms. Bathrooms are a very difficult thing because it's a matter of privacy, right? You go to the bathroom to relieve yourself. It's a biological thing. But now, because of the context that we live in a society which has high levels of gender-based violence and high levels of, you know, measures that you can just be accosted. We have this separation of bathrooms when it comes to female and male, or women and men, right? But the difficulty is again then that particular cohort of people that are diverse in terms of their gender identity, that are diverse in terms of their biology, that are diverse in terms of their gender expression. Where do they go to do this very needed biological action? And but then these structural violences also still affect them, right? So that's another way in which we can do better. Then, in terms of leave, so usually the workplace is very framed in a heteronormative, and when I say heteronormative, it means it champions this idea that heterosexual relationships, being attracted to someone of the opposite sex, is the norm. So, when it comes to leave, we have civil unions in our country, which is the piece of legislation that allows for same sex or same gendered marriage. But now, when you are in the workplace, we call it, for instance, it could be called spousal leave, for instance, instead of, you know, um, leave for same-sex partners. But also, in addition to that, I want to speak about leave in general and challenges that are faced by the LGBTI community. A lot of the time when it comes to it, leave would maybe be needed for things like artificial insemination processes for lesbians, right? We speak about paternity and maternity leave, but what does it mean in a situation where the couples are same gendered or same sex? So, how do we create those mechanisms in the workplace to be more inclusive of that? Then, one of the other structural violences would mean measures of discrimination that exist is also the lack of disciplinary actions for homophobic or transphobic um, behaviors. Also, dress codes are also very binary in our society. So we expected in some vocations to dress a certain way, whether it be formally or informally. But we also expected to then adhere to a measure of fitting into these normative gender roles that are female or male, right? And if you veer from that, somehow it becomes a problem in the workplace. I'll give you an example, a very practical example. So the friend that I had mentioned that was intersex of mine, they worked for the police force. And conventionally, it says that if you are a woman, you're supposed to wear a dress. And this is in the Northern Cape, right? Where they a lot more stringent in terms of uniform. I know you're going to say, yeah, in Gauteng, the female or the woman police officers wear pants. But in the Northern Cape, they still have a very traditional way, even in dressing in the police force. So um my friend once felt like in their gender expression, they don't necessarily want to wear the male uniform because it's not indicative of who they are. They would like to fluctuate between those two uniforms, and they then went on to embark on trying to create those inclusions. Unfortunately, my friend, because of this, resigned from their position, but now they've told me that all of the efforts to push back in terms of this kind of inclusion has made it possible in the Northern Cape to have this measure of then being able to wear the different uniforms without feeling like you're not compliant to the workplace rules around dress code. Then other forms of structural violence is just non-acknowledgement. So if you, for instance, don't make provision in terms of your policies, in terms of awareness sessions, in terms of your human resource kits or toolkits, or in terms of remedial actions for disciplinary actions, then these are how you perpetuate non-acknowledgement in the workplace. And then also inclusive language, I feel government has somewhat been progressive in this to a certain degree because we refer to ourselves as colleagues, we refer to to everybody that creates certain gender neutral terms, right? But then when we go to functions that are, let's say, a seminar, a after work, um, conference, or whatever situation, then we no longer say colleagues, then all of a sudden it's ladies and gentlemen. And these are also one of the microaggressions in which we can then counter to ensure that we don't create that distinction. So instead of saying, for instance, do you have a wife or a husband, you can say a spouse, right? So there are certain kind of gender neutral terminologies that can be used in the workplace not to draw that distinction. Okay. And then in terms of interpersonal discrimination and violences, so these are more direct. And this includes hate speech. So people would blatantly use discriminatory words that would cause offense. Some of these would be, for instance, we know in Cape Town they use the terminology morphe. In Gauteng, they would call you Stabani. Or in general, they would basically, hate speech doesn't also have to be terminology, but also in what you say and how you express yourself. If you tell someone that is transgender that you will never be a woman, even though you've changed your hormones, you've gone on hormones, because your documentation doesn't speak to that, and because you haven't had bottom surgery, that is a measure of hate speech, which is now illegal in our country, right? Um, in various forms because of the hate crime and hate speech bill that has recently been, the Hate Crime and Hate Speech Act that has been signed into law by the president last year. Then we also have hate crimes, which are very more blatant. So hate crimes come in a lot of forms. This can be in the form of physical violences. It can be in the form of arson, or damage to property, eviction, all and all hate crimes are usually crimes that are firstly against the law. You're not supposed to be doing these things. But what distinguishes hate crimes is the fact that they are also message crimes. So they want to send a message to a particular person that you should not exist. I'm going to inflict this harm to you because of your orientation, your gender identity, your gender expression, or because of your sex characteristics, right? So hate crimes would be, for instance, what we call, I know maybe people have heard this term, I don't necessarily like using it at all, when they say corrective rape of lesbians. But also that is very problematic because we know you can't correct someone by sexually assaulting them. So we call it homophobic rape instead, right? So things like homophobic rape are hate crimes. Things like kidnapping because someone is on the basis of their sexual orientation um, is a hate crime. I'm not sure if colleagues have seen, but there's been a high spate of individuals that are now being kidnapped on a dating app called Grindr and being held hostage. They're either blackmailed because some of them are not necessarily haven't disclosed the sexual orientation or their gender identity, so they're being blackmailed, they're being extorted for money. So these are also other forms of hate crimes. And then of course murder. And I think for me personally, a lot of South Africans don't know the extent to which um, hate crimes can are existent in South Africa. We work with the Department of Justice and we work with the National Prosecuting Authority and the South African Police Service on something that's called the National Task Team. And we monitor hate crimes and we escalate them. So I just want to give you all an indication. There are about 30 hate crimes that are on this monitoring list. And every month we meet to discuss them. Where are we in terms of those hate crimes in the criminal justice system? Are they being escalated? Are there movements? What are the sentences that are also attached to these hate crimes? Because sometimes we found that with hate crimes perpetuated toward LGBTI persons, the sentencing is not as harsh. The cases are easily dismissed. Judges themselves, lawyers, people who are advocates may themselves be homophobic and transphobic and not necessarily create the best remedies or solutions for their client when they are in a situation where they want to combat hate crimes. So hate crimes are actually a huge problem in our country, and those are the different ways in which it can be, in which it can manifest, right? And then we've got micro and macro aggressions here. So when we speak about, these interpersonal relations, I'm thinking about colleagues that are overly religious, right? I mean, we back in the day, I'm not sure. I think we've veered away from this a bit more now. But there would always be threads that are overtly religious or that speak to Christianity only, or that speak to different people's faith beliefs only, and these would then be circulated on email, and not to say that religion is not allowed in the workplace, but as people that are in public service, we do also have to acknowledge the framing in which we also operate as people that are trying to bring service delivery to um to people in South Africa and the South African workplace, which is a secular workplace. It makes place for all of these measures to exist in its nuances. So whether it be you diverse in terms of your religion, your culture, your orientation, or then your gender identity, space should be made for all of that. But if you have a colleague that comes with the Bible and is giving it and putting it on another colleague's, you know, desk and saying you should read this as a means to kind of try inadvertently address the orientation or gender identity, those are what we call microaggressions. Microaggressions can also include things like misgendering someone. If you know someone pronoun is she and her, and then you would deliberately use he and he pronouns, him and him pronouns. So these are different ways in which people then, exude discrimination in the workplace. So I want to take us through some of the anti-hate discriminatory legislation that exists in South Africa. And some of you may be attuned to this, and some of this may be new to you for the first time, right? So we have Section 9 of the Constitution, Section 9.3 of the Constitution, which is the Equality Clause. And this is a brilliant piece of law because it was also part of the restitution project of apartheid, right? What a lot of people don't know about um, queer persons and LGBTI persons in South Africa is that we were criminalized under apartheid as well. Under the Immorality Act, it was blatantly said, and it was very specific because it referred to what we call then the sodomy laws, right? So under the Immorality Act, there was blatant provisions said that same-sex relations are not allowed, and they classified this under the Sodomy Act. So if you were being suspected of being particularly gay, they didn't really speak that much to the inclusion of women and lesbianism. But if you were accused of being gay, you could, for instance, go to jail under apartheid law. So there are a whole lot of case studies and a whole lot of lived experiences of people that under apartheid law were incarcerated in South Africa because of their orientation. And that time when we spoke about orientation, that was the most fervent way in which we were being classified as a community. Gender identity, transgendered people, intersex people, the conversations weren't even around it at that time that the apartheid laws were made or as prevalent in society as it is now. So Section 9 of the Constitution is beautiful because it speaks to this point of restitution, right? And it says that everyone is equal before the law and that unfair discrimination by the state or anyone else based on a person's sexual orientation or gender identity and expression is never allowed. So that's what we have on Section 9. Then Section 10 states that every person has the right to dignity. And I really love this piece of legislation, and I included that as anti-hate discrimination because usually one of the markers of LGBTI people is that they are marginalized to the point structurally and administratively and interpersonally that it does affect their dignity, that they are made to feel less than, that they can't, for instance, stand up for themselves in particular contexts. And that affects how you operate in the world, how you move in the world, whether you have confidence, whether you're able to show up for yourself, if you're able to look after your own wellness, or all of those factors, right? Then Section 12 states that everyone has the right to freedom and security. This means that no one may arrest you for no reason, torture you, or treat you in a cruel, inhumane, or degrading or violent way. And this often happens to LGBTI people. I just explained about the context of people being kidnapped, but then also in the workplace, if you constantly being avoided, or there are maybe murmurings and rumors that are circulated about you, or if people make comments about your dress sense, that would make you feel like they are not but they are also then creating a measure of disallowance for you. Those are also things that affect freedom and security. Then Section 14 states that everybody has the right to privacy. And yeah, I want to go back to what we had discussed, that particular question about Tabile, right? About, do people disclose? If people want to disclose, it is their decision to disclose their orientation or their gender identity. It need not necessarily be forced upon them. So please do not out someone if they give you that confidence to say in the workplace, okay, I am lesbian, I am gay, I am transgender. Maybe they were just telling you and for safety, right? Because currently we don't have the mechanisms in place as yet to create those protections. We have a long way to go in terms of policy and legislation and reforms, which we will unpack shortly. But I also just wanted to say to you that if Johnny says to you, I'm gay, don't go tell everybody in the office that Johnny's gay. Johnny told you for a particular reason. Maybe because certain things were, he wanted to get access to certain things that are not available, or maybe because he felt safe, or maybe because it's the reality of his life and he feels comfortable enough to convey it, right? Then Section 27 states that every person has the health to rights, healthcare and right to get healthcare services, including reproductive healthcare services, and no one may be refused emergency and medical treatment. So the reason why I put this particular aspect into our presentation is so that we can speak to things like policies, right? A lot of the time, particularly in government, we have GEMS, medical health care, um, or medical aid, right? So now what happens in terms of people whose gender identity is diverse, like transgendered persons, who biologically speaking are nuanced in the way that they are, uh, and then also intersex people who are nuanced. What kind of health provision are we actually looking at here? You know, certain things, certain times people forget that trans men, those were assigned female at birth and now align their gender identity to be a trans man, they still physically have characteristics that speak to being a female, right? Like a vagina. So trans men can menstruate, for instance. Do we take that into account? Do we indicate that some transgendered women may still make use of condoms, do we look at things like, are we including hormone therapy for transgender people as something that just comes standard with a medical aid? Are we making better ways to also then look at what coverage is possible in terms of medical interventions, holistically speaking? When we look at same-sex couples, are we taking into consideration that artificial insemination and all of these other mechanisms are then, for instance, um, that they also require money and that they require support from medical aids as well. How do we create policies, even in that measure, to ensure that when we speak to employment equity, these things are present from the get go? I also just wanted to speak to, for instance, leave around when someone has mental health issues or when they're facing challenges in that degree. What kind of policy provisions do we have in the workplace for that? And then also, if someone had to go for surgery that is gender affirming surgery, how do we make provisions in our policies for that as well? Okay. Then moving on, we've got the Hate Crime and Hate Speech Act. I said bill here, but I think this slide is a bit outdated. It's the Hate Crime and Hate Speech Act. So you can't. So we have hate crime and hate speech legislation that speaks to brilliantly trying cases in terms of hate crimes and not just necessary means of discrimination, just like straightforward means of discrimination anymore, right? So you can get harsher sentences now because if you commit hate crimes or hate speech in South Africa. Then the Civil Union Amendment Bill was a piece of legislation that also existed. So this has to do with the other flip side of the coin of workplace inclusion. The Civil Union Amendment Bill was a small piece of legislation that exists in the Civil Union Act. So by means of the Civil Union, there's a section 6 in there that says, that used to say rather, that by means of conscientious objection, same-sex couple. So this was a very problematic because it meant that public servants could then be discriminatory toward LGBTI people or same-sex couples. We've since taken out that piece of legislation in South Africa, so now Home Affairs officials have to then execute their mandate in terms of creating holistic, services. Then the alteration of description of 6 Act of 49. So this is the cornerstone of what we call legal gender recognition for transgender and intersex people in South Africa. So I described the processes of having to be experience a medical intervention to change your sex descriptor in South Africa. So that would be from M to M, F to M. So this is the law and framing that allows for that, but it's still very problematic because we still need to ensure that we'll get to a point where people don't necessarily have to be on hormones to change the gender marker. We'll have mitigating factors in place, of course, like maybe psychological support, signing off from doctors before you change your gender marker, but not everybody would want to go with that. And then we've got PROPUDA, which is also known the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act of 2000. And PROPUDA also plays a huge part to combat discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and then also sex characteristics. There is one piece of legislation that I have left out here, and that is obviously the Employment Equity Act, um, which is a general protection across the workplace. I think I do have some international laws as well that I want to look at. So the international framework that exists um, would be the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, which states all humans are entitled to rights and freedoms without discrimination. This includes in the workplace. And then we have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation. We've got regional treaties that speak to the African Charter. Julian, I see your hand is up.
Hi, Roche. Just checking. Is your slides moving on your side, or
Yes,
have you
they
still on the
are.
first
Are
slide?
they not? Are they not moving for everybody else?
No. On our side, it's just on the same slide of discrimination.
Okay, let me see if I can remedy this one moment. Okay, so you haven't seen any of the anti-hate discrimination legislation at all.
No, no.
Oh, wow. Oh, is there any difference now?
No, there's nothing on my side. It's still on the first page, on the first slide.
Okay, let's see if I just try and stop. Um, okay, let's see.
Okay, now you've moved to the second slide. On our side, we can see the anti-discriminatory legislation.
Yes, this is what I was just speaking to. Imagine, colleagues, I've gone through so much and obviously I can't see the chat, so I didn't even know that it was not showing. Um, but let me then maybe just keep it this way, Julian, and I'll just try to increase my screen so that
We can see the full slide. It's not a problem with seeing the full slide. I
okay.
think
I
it was
think I'll
just
just
moving.
move it. I'll move it manually then so that everybody's on the same page. So sorry, colleagues, sorry about that. I wasn't aware that it was not visible. So like I said, these are just a few of the sections, section 9, 10, 12, 14, 27, the Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Bill, the Civil Union Amendment Bill, the Alteration of Sex Descriptors Act, right? Okay. And then the international frameworks is what I'm speaking to. So yes, we mentioned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We spoke about the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which prohibits discrimination. Then we have the African Charter on Human People's Rights. So it lacks LGBTI protections at the moment, but it does establish broader human rights principles. And colleagues, I do want to convey to you that we are at the moment in a state of crux as LGBTI persons because there's been such great measures and funding and strategies in place to ensure that on the African continent that LGBTI persons are experiencing criminalization in their country again. So what South Africa had then abandoned under the rule of apartheid is happening on so many places like Uganda, Kenya, and also in places like Ghana, which creates huge problems because now, if you can't live and work in your place of birth and you might get jailed or you might face death or persecution, this is where we have a cohort of what we call asylum seekers and refugees that are LGBTI specifically, right? And so South Africa deals with an influx of asylum seekers that cannot find home in the country because of the criminalization that happens there. And of course, for LGBTI people in South Africa, there are so many things that still need to happen.